Alright, welcome to our lesson on sexual orientation. We're going to get right in here and then we're going to take a look at the definition of sexual orientation. So, sexual orientation is the patterned way in which a person views and expresses the sexual component of his and her personality. What they're saying here simply is it refers to a person's sexual attraction and activities. In other words, who are individuals attracted to and who are they involved in sexual relationships with. And so the four types of sexual orientations that exist are heterosexuality, which is of course attraction to the opposite sex, homosexuality, which is attraction to people of the same sex, bisexuality, which is attraction to people of both sexes, and asexuality, which is indifference towards or lack of attraction to either sex. So one thing that we see here is that over time, over the last few generations, our attitudes, or people's attitudes towards sexual orientation has changed pretty drastically. And of course, you see we're in the middle of that right now, where you see the legalization of gay marriage in quite a few states, and of course, almost certainly the eventual legalization of same-sex marriage throughout the country. When exactly, I'm not sure, but certainly we're heading in that direction. And what's really happened, of course, is that people's attitudes have changed. These categories haven't changed. I mean, that is, once scientists discovered these doing their studies, these attitudes haven't changed. They've been around probably forever. But what has happened is people's attitudes towards each of these groups have changed in some way, shape, or form, or just towards sexuality in general. And so we'll talk about that in a second. But first I want to look where sexual orientation comes from. And sexual orientation, whether or not we're homosexual, heterosexual, bisexual, asexual, these are really this is part of our nature. It's biologically programmed. So you see those first two say nature and biologically programmed. That's really the important part of where our sexual orientation comes from. And what I mean by that is it's part of our genetic code. It's who we are. It's something we're born with. Sexual orientations are things that we're born with. And they're things that are deeply rooted in our genetics somewhere. Now, notice the third one says cultural, and I want to warn you on this. When I say cultural, I don't mean that people choose, that is, your sexual orientation is related to your culture by the choice of whether or not you're homosexual or heterosexual, because it's not really a choice in that regard. When we say culture, we're saying that the ways we express ourselves, what's appropriate, what's seen as right, what's seen as wrong, the rules and habits related to sexual orientations, those are what's related to culture. Right? So be very clear that our sexual orientation, by all evidence, is natural and biologically programmed. We see, for example, we see homosexuality in the animal kingdom as well. So it's something in the way that people are born. The culture has to do with just what is appropriate for each sexual orientation, or what's appropriate within your own culture. So don't make the mistake of thinking that says that your culture determines whether you are homosexual or heterosexual or bisexual, whatever. And that's not what we're saying. We're just saying it's related to some of the rules. So I'm going to zoom out here. I'm going to take you up here to take a little look at how attitudes towards sexuality have changed over time. And when we talk about attitudes towards sexual orientation, we can really tie it to general attitudes towards sexuality as well. That is or attitudes towards sex as well. So I'm going to show you just historically how things have changed a bit, and sort of where the ideas came from, and in fact how some of those old ideas are still around. But when we're looking at sexual orientation or sexuality in the United States, if we go back into the 1700s and the early 1800s, the dominant attitude of the time was that sex was to be used for reproduction. That was really the only purpose of sex, was for reproduction. So in the 18th and 19th century, this kind of goes back in some ways to this even further, those puritanical sort of roots. All non-reproductive sex was considered deviant. Right? So anything that did not or could not result in a child was seen as deviant, because that was really the only purpose of sex. That was the prevalent attitude. So it was easy to see how homosexuality became viewed as a very negative thing in that light, because this was sort of from a morality, a religious standpoint, that was sort of the norms of the day. Homosexuality was particularly bad simply because it could not result in children. It was non-reproductive sex. So that was how sexuality was seen, sort of early American, early history of the United States. But then the beginnings of psychology and sociology, the social sciences, medical sciences became more evolved. And what happened is attitudes started to change. In fact, what we start to see in the 1800s through the early 20th century, so the early 1900s, is that homosexuality and heterosexuality became seen as a health concern. So what we start to see is that heterosexuality becomes seen as healthy. So heterosexuality was seen as the norm, it was seen as the typical, it was seen as healthy. Homosexuality was being seen as unhealthy. So they continued sort of the negative attitudes towards homosexuality, but it wasn't so much a morality issue as it was seen as a health issue. And so in medicine, homosexuality was considered an illness to be treated. And just to show you this is not true anymore, this is an old edition, but there's a book called the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is something used by psychologists. In fact, it has listed in there every psychological disorder known to humankind. And in the old books, under this one category called sexual deviations, and I know it's hard to read, but under sexual deviations, you would see that there would be all of these things that people were seen as being deviant, that is bad. So pedophilia was in there, fetishism was in there, sadism and masochism was in there. But at the very top you see that this notion of homosexuality was in there as well. Homosexuality was seen as a deviance, as something to be treated through medical treatments of some way, shape, or form. Well, of course, in the 20th century, in the 1960s, comes the sexual revolution, and the sexual revolution really starts to change people's attitudes towards sex in general and towards sexuality. And what ends up happening here is in the late 20th century, our attitudes begin to change. So the same people who are related to that book, the DSM I was just telling you about, this is the official statement now for the American Psychological Association from 1974 on, so this has been quite a while now. But homosexuality is not a mental disorder, and thus there is no need for a cure. So this is a change in how people saw the idea of homosexuality. Now homosexuality is seen more and more as part of one's biology, part of one's being, just part of one's nature, and it is what it is. It's no longer seen as or it's no longer seen in general in society as a medical disorder, or as some deviance or some crime or something along those lines, which it had been in the past in various places. And of course you all are alive to see this real redefinition working. So this is that idea of a social definition, right? We are creating our own realities, us as a group, and we redefine things over time. And so this is the map for 2013. It's changed already. It's 2014. But what we have seen, of course, is more and more states are legalizing gay marriage, and almost certainly, I don't know any legal scholar who doesn't think that it probably will. Every state will have legal gay marriage sometime in the relative near future. So attitudes really change significantly towards sexuality. And like I said, a lot of this comes from the fact that psychology and sociology and the medical sciences are doing more and more research, and they're looking at this from more of a scientific perspective. And to show you one of the pioneers of this research, this is a guy named Kinsey, who was doing research on sexuality in the 1940s and 50s. And he is really one of the individuals who, doing his surveys and talking to people and doing all of his studies, found that sexuality was not really the way that many people thought of it. And that is, people oftentimes thought that people were either straight or gay, And there wasn't really an in between. There weren't really, you were 100% straight or 100% gay, and that was not what Kinsey found when he did research. So when Kinsey was doing research, he found that people really fall on a scale. He numbered these from 0 to 6, so there's 7 categories. At one side, there's exclusively heterosexual behavior. So this is people who are only ever been involved in heterosexual behavior. On the other side is exclusively homosexual behavior. But he found that there were a lot of people that actually fell somewhere in the middle. That is, it wasn't this binary, you were either this or this necessarily categories. You might be more heterosexual, you may be exclusively heterosexual, but you may be more heterosexual, or you might be more homosexual, but you may not be exclusively 100% that. So he was going here by people's behaviors. What had they done in their lifetime? What sort of sexual activities had they been involved in? What had they been attracted to at various points? So this really helped us sort of understand in many ways this notion of bisexual behavior. But notice this idea of a scale here. And then, of course, in Kinsey's reports, and these, of course, have been redone over and over again, but we see that about 3% of men identify as partially or totally homosexual. About 1.5% of women do the same thing. Yet 9% of men and 4% of women had reported some homosexual activity during their lifetime. So these numbers are sort of more related to now what we view as sort of the natural or biological, the biological states that people have. So I just wanted to show you that, give you a brief sort of introduction to sexual orientation, and so, as always, be sure to look at all the materials in the material folder. Be sure to read the chapter. That is where the questions come from. Remember, you have those objectives for each lesson. Use those to guide your reading and guide your studying. And as always, have a great week.